Hello and welcome to our second last Lincoln Link seminar. That went by really quickly, and thank you guys, Xanita and Waqas, for the amazing series you put on this year. It has truly been fantastic. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. So our fellow tonight is Dr. Perry Gauci. He is basically a lifer of Lincoln. He completed his BA with us in modern history and obtained both his MPhil and DPhil in early modern history, just next door at Brasenose College. Perry has published extensively on the political and social development of the English state from 1650 until 1750, and he's particularly interested in the role of the local and regional on wider scale social and political change. James Barr is our alumnus tonight. He completed his MA in modern history at Lincoln College and has since worked in politics, international relations, and commercial enterprises. He is the author of A Line in the Sand, Britain, France, and the Struggle That Shaped the Middle East, Setting the Desert on Fire, and Lords of the Desert. He is currently a visiting fellow at King's College, London. And finally, we have Philip Decker, who is currently completing his MPhil in international relations. He is concentrating on Russian propaganda and soft power in Western Europe. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Swarthmore College with a major in history and minors in political science and German studies. He has worked for the Woodrow Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C., the American Council on Germany in New York, and the ZZF in Potsdam. Can you please join me in welcoming our speakers?
Good evening. Thank you very much to the organisers. We're obviously in the spirit of thankfulness at the moment, so thanks for the opportunity to debate this question: should historians be more political? And this is a very good question to ask. When I first heard it, my immediate answer was no. Why inflict politics on us dear historians? We've got enough troubles as it is. But then, within about 10 seconds, I thought, actually, a little voice inside me did make me think, well, should historians be more active in the public sphere? That broad definition of politics, if you like. And immediately I had these images of me on my white charger, galloping up to Westminster, entering the debating chamber of the House of Commons, and with a brilliant analogy between Brexit and the loss of the American colonies in 1783, give a great lecture on how to lose with dignity, basically. And then everyone on both sides of the house hugging each other with glee and clapping me out of the building. And so I'm in a sort of a head and heart quandary about this question. My head, my rational academic head, says no, and my heart, my commitment to a subject I hold dear and the significance of the subject I hold dear, I want to say yes. So hopefully the debate tonight will tip me over the edge. But at the moment, I still say no with some important qualifications. Now, not only is this a good question, I think it's an important question. And in common with the statements I've just given, it does, I think this question, the fact that we're asking it, reflects the miserable state we're in at the moment. First, on a more political side, I think it reflects our yearning for a moral voice in the current culture wars, which have turned many against the world of politics, which is seen as a world of vacuous sound bites, alternative facts, and of course too many experts. But also on the history side, it poses good questions for my own profession and about the ultimate function or functions of history as an academic and as a public discipline. And I think it's a question that could usefully be posed to any discipline, and we might do so in discussion today. But I think not only is it a good question and an important question, I think it's a difficult question. And I think it does raise more issues than one might suspect at first sight. And certainly we've got to be careful about the definitional space that we allocate to the political, in inverted commas. In fact, I think my initial no could readily swing to a qualified yes if I could get some reassurances on the sort of politics we're talking about here. And I think it's going to be crucial to the sort of arguments I want to make over the next 12 minutes. Because I think the main argument I would say is that history, especially good history, capital G, capital H, has always had a political aspect. Although it's also had a need for its independence to be preserved, which is so vital to its moral voice. And there have to be some safeguards or preconditional parameters in place. I'd also argue that we have to recognise that if historians are going to be more political, that their impact will always be contingent on the identity of their targeted audience, and also probably in the modern age, contingent on the media through which its message is channeled. Now, given the time available, I thought in order to test the wisdom of this proposition that I give you a brief history of histories over the last 500 years. So please bear with me, it will be quite a quick ride. But I think such breadth does help us to spotlight some of the key variables that might govern a healthy relationship or a healthy conversation between history and the political sphere. And I hopefully can show you the first. And when I was thinking about the impact of history and whether historians should be part of a more political conversation, I came up with these variables, really, that affect the way in which historians participate in political processes and also the likely success of their participation and impact. Now, historical method, audience, the type of polity that the historian is functioning, they all add up and are mutually reinforcing to this question of impact. And at the top left-hand corner, you can also put historical persona, which is that historians play different roles within historical debates, but also in particular as they move into a public sphere, they play different roles in a more political space. And I'm going to rattle through 5 randomly selected historians to illustrate my points. The first is Nicola Machiavelli, who I've designated as Mr. Angry, the sort of historian who cajoles, provokes, incites an audience by an engagement with the past. Now, the point I've been making about him, he's a natural history and politics guy. If he applied as an undergraduate to this college, we'd probably take him, I think. He would undoubtedly be a historian and politician. Now, he looked to the past not just through great works like The Prince and The Discourses, but actually as a working politician. You know, to him they are interchangeable. So really he's our model, the archetype of the historical politician. But what I would argue here is that the type of historical politician he was predicated on, if you like, a shared culture. And that's the humanist circles of the Florentine Republic of the late 15th, early 16th century, which promoted the dialogue of present and past. And his audience was had to be fairly educated, it was limited at the time, and they got the nuances of what he was trying to get across. Now, it's a galling thing that I say this is a good, healthy, direct, and constant conversation, but he had little impact. You know, the Florentine Republic is doomed. So, even if the conversation is good, Mr. Angry stays angry. Okay? The next one, Edward Gibbon, to Britain in the 18th century. And what we actually have here is the philosopher, a historian who takes history in the round. In his great work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, you get 12 centuries, you get 6 volumes, you get vast territories. Because for Gibbon, commenting directly on contemporary affairs was not his main priority at all. He has a cosmic vision, if you like. He's a universalist historian. Yes, if the universal principles and lessons tell a contemporary audience what it needs to know, well, that's a benefit. But what he's looking at is a much bigger picture. Actually, as a politician, he's hopeless. He's a backbencher, a placeman in the 18th century English Parliament. But his vision is one that's compelling, but unfortunately, again, limited. And as I'm being very generous in his impact. Moving to the 19th century, Thomas Babington Macaulay, the great so-called Whig historian of progress, British progress, well, English progress. And really, he's actually one of the most impactful, influential historians on the list that I'm going to show here. Why is that? Well, his impact is partly, he is an active young politician in the 1820s, big behind reform, and he can actually make a compelling argument by looking at a narrative, a story of British history, which can more or less convince a contemporary audience, quite a broad contemporary audience as well. Say sort of popular, it's very much middling sort, but it's a growing one at the time. He can convince them that changing to preserve is a powerful message and must be accepted. Thank you. 5 minutes. Now, he actually does see some change, and for most of the rest of his career, he does become more conservative and writes very long histories which are beautifully written, which convince his contemporary generations that they should preserve the reforms that they have and no more, and not take the mad European route. Next up, into the modern age, Linda Colley, the magician, as I call it. This is a wonderful modern historian working in the modern academic academy, and she is someone, I call her the magician because she can find almost the beauty and the surprise in the discovery of history, and can sell this, both the, if you like, the mystery and the drama of history with good academic rigor, in order to suck the audience in and deliver, a powerful message. And she's made several key interventions on big issues like national identity, constitution framing, and even slavery. And she is someone who I think it's a good model. She's serious, public audiences have liked her. I say uncertain contemporary political impact because she's remained largely within the academy. She's remained within the American Academy. She's based at Princeton, and that has given her, I think, more of a public footprint, if you like. I think the Americans are better at connecting past and present, more so than the UK Academy. But certainly a magician who shows the potential in the modern age. And then finally, Felix Kloss, Lincoln NCR 2014-15. Okay, this is one of your recent predecessors who wrote a powerful book, 64 powerful pages. Churchill on Europe, we've already heard Churchill as the historian. And I've given him the XYZ factor. He does have the X factor. He's a good-looking boy, very someone who should be selling history for us. There's no doubt about it. Presentation's important. But what we actually see with Felix's work is that he connects generations. He's active, he's a politician, he's worked both in the US and in European liberal parties in order to communicate, well, not just to communicate, but to actively promote sort of political change. And as I say, it's too early to say how he would sort of fare, but he's certainly someone to watch the future. And he gives me hope that history will be well served and politics will be well served by such effective communicators. That little run through leaves me with three big messages, I think. First of all, it's clear that history has been political for centuries, although within different cultural contexts which have enabled a different form of historical conversation with and within the political world. Second of all, good history can indeed be partisan in context, but it is unlikely to achieve its ultimate aims. Most of these historians in politics do not achieve their aims, and it is better to play the long political game here, if only for the preservation of an independent political voice. And thirdly, we have to think quite carefully tonight about problems of process. When, where, how should a historian be more political? Particularly on the how front, how do we deliver complexity for a modern political audience, especially within the context of modern multimedia? And I think there's much to discuss here. Because I think we do need our presenters, our headliners, but we actually need a lot of grassroots work to instill a rigorous popular interest in history. And I think the schools and universities have their role to play. And that's why I think the historian should stay for the moment in the academy. Because it's only when that broader political audience demands greater competence from their leaders that history can do its best work, forcing the present to engage its past in thought-provoking and rigorous debate. For sure, this sort of conversation would be to the advantage of the healthy republic and the virtuous historian, and I thank the Lincoln League organisers for the opportunity to indulge in that exhilarating process tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. A big thank you to Waqas and to Xanita and to Angeliki for the invitation tonight. It's a pleasure to see the room full. I'm really, really pleased to be back. It's 25 years since I was an undergraduate here. So anniversary. It feels slightly sad to think about in a way, because it feels like yesterday. I honestly think that I might see somebody from my year appear at the back of the room any minute now, because the place doesn't change that much, even though this room is a very new place. When I was here, I remember very early on having tutorials in the Wesley room with Paul Langford, and I thought about this tonight as Perry's email pinged in as I was on the train on the way up here to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Paul Langford's book, Polite and Commercial People, which, if you haven't read it, is a brilliant book, an absolutely brilliant example of where academic history hits a popular audience and has broad relevance. And we would sit in Paul's tutorials, and often, I was doing British History 3, and it was the first term of my first year, and the phone would ring, and Paul would never leave the phone, he'd pick it up. And if you knew him, you know what he's like. And he would have a conversation, maybe slightly sotto voce, but with us still in the room, a couple of us having the tutorial. And you'd hear one half of some sort of bit of academics, political plotting going on. So the one half of the intrigue. And I think that illustrates my gut reaction to the question tonight, which is the opposite of Perry's. It is, yes, historians should absolutely be more political. We are political, whether we like it or not. We are political animals, and many historians take a great delight in being actively involved in politics, and I have myself. And I think actually that's actually borne out in your 500-year suite. You can see the sort of effects of trying to communicate big ideas in a very concise way, which is really what a lot of political communication is about, in the way that Perry attacked that, because you want to try and get across the sort of the broad thrust of what you're saying in a brief amount of time to someone who is very busy. And that is, in a sense, is how I first reacted to the question, because I didn't really, when I read the question, when I was first invited, I didn't think, oh, does that mean historians being more partisan or more sort of controversial? I thought, is that historians being more involved in politics, full stop, and policy making? Perhaps from quite a neutral perspective, but getting their expertise in front of people who are making decisions, because I think there is a demand for that. I think that Michael Gove's comment, the very frequently repeated one about the no need for experts, is not actually, it reflected something quite deep, but it doesn't reflect the fact that politicians don't want to hear from people who are experts. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But of course the referendum campaign in 2016 really brought this all to a head, and you had historians for Remain and historians for Britain battling it out, and I'm very delighted I didn't sign a letter on either side of that debate, because I don't believe that that's what historians should be doing. They shouldn't be involved in a kind of what should the country should be doing. It's far more useful now as we're trying to understand what happened, to understand why, what kind of reasons there are for the vote to leave in 2016, and indeed actually why we're now making, I think what could frankly honestly be described as a bit of a pig's ear of leaving itself, and the difficulty of that. And actually I sort of criticise myself, because I sort of feel that actually from my own work, from looking at the way in which previous British governments have made decisions in the past, looking at a kind of the sort of job that they have got to do now, leaving the EU makes I should have realised from what I knew that this was going to be a very difficult job for any government, no matter how good the quality to do. Of course, there's also the sort of argument about what Churchill, what would he have done? Which I'm not sure if that Felix tackles that in the book, but that's always looking out there. Churchill is always brought into any historical argument these days. Most egregiously the other day with John MacDonald being asked about whether he was a hero or villain. Prompting a sort of black and white response, and then a whole load of historians piling in to say, well, actually, it's rather complicated. So I'm not really thinking about that kind of history. I'm thinking more about the sort of more complex and the nuance. And to try and illustrate that, I'm going to tell you what I did, because I left here in 1997, and I went and worked in politics. It was something that I didn't expect to do at all. I had no political engagement here at all for any political party, but I ended up quite deeply involved in politics as a junior researcher. And it was an absolutely fascinating insight into life, I suppose. You get a very good idea very quickly about how politics really works, and how in particular, the most interesting, most alarming thing that I saw was just how the circumstances in which quite important decisions could be made, depending on the circumstances, and you see that all kind in history going way back now. I recognise these sorts of things. So, for example, the dinner that Eden had with his chiefs of staff on the night that they had heard that Nasser had nationalised the Suez Canal, when everyone had come out of a rather big dinner, probably having had a few glasses of wine, and then essentially set the ball rolling that turned into the Suez crisis. So you could sort of see those sorts of things. I can see that from personal experience. And while I was doing that, I wrote a book. It was a smallish history of a think tank, but that really got me interested in writing. And I wanted to then try and get more involved. And this is where I suppose became more political, because essentially, as soon as you're trying to write any kind of popular history, you are becoming political, because you're trying to satisfy a market, or trying to persuade a publisher that there is a market for something that you want to write about. And so I had, at that point, wanted to write a book that would probably sell now. It was going to be about British engagement in the Middle East. This was 2002. So before the Iraq invasion, but after 9/11, and more importantly, actually, after the Intifada had begun in Israel-Palestine, which had actually got people interested in the Middle East, even before 9/11. And in fact, the publisher said, no, that, or at least my agent said, no, that won't sell. There's no interest in that. But at that point in time, people wanted to hear some quite detailed story, and so I ended up writing the nth book about Lawrence of Arabia. There have been loads of books about Lawrence of Arabia. There's room always for one more, and I wrote one of them. But it's not even, there's probably been about 10 written since mine, at least. But that got me interested in Middle East politics in a big way. And of course, I was trying to respond to this market. The book did okay. Interestingly, in the time it took me to actually write it, in a sense, the interest in it changed, because by that point, by 2006, when it came out, it was very clear that the Americans were stuck fighting this very big insurgency in northern Iraq. Lawrence was being called out as a historical, maybe Lawrence can explain how to fix this problem. Of course, actually, what Lawrence actually told you was that an insurgency is almost impossible to win by regular forces. From that, I then wrote a book about something that Lawrence had done. The most interesting thing about Lawrence was for me, that hadn't really been explored very clearly, was his anti-Frenchness, his Francophobia, to put it more precisely. And so that turned into a new book about Anglo-French rivalry in the Middle East from the First World War through to 1948. And it's that book that is, frankly, the reason why I've been invited tonight, because it wasn't an obvious book to do well, but in the end it did do well because of circumstances that had nothing to do with me. I'd written a perfectly good book, but then the timing was exactly right. And it became political because of timing rather than anything else. But it was a good book to read if you needed to mug up on the subject. And the subject was ISIS, Daesh, who appeared in 2013 or so, and then in 2014 announced the end of Sykes-Picot, as they call it. This was the agreement to divide the Middle East in 1916. And basically my book started with Sykes-Picot, and if you put book about Sykes-Picot into Google, you've got my book very, very quickly. So I suddenly found myself being asked to come and talk about things. Now, I had absolutely nothing to add to how to defeat Daesh or anything like that, but I had written a book about Sykes-Picot agreement that had now become this subject of considerable controversy. And it explained a bit about British-French involvement. Some people said, it's a brilliant history of the Middle East. It's not at all. It is a story of one part of this issue, not the whole thing at all. But it was fun to write. In retrospect, it was hell to write at the time, and it's an interesting book. But I'd also chosen it because I knew that something about Anglo-French rivalry would sell here. That was a simple fact. So I was being sort of contorted by commercial forces as well. It also, I have to admit, slightly piqued my own personal Euroscepticism too. So it ticked lots of different boxes. So that's where I came in. I always think I remember the sense of dread when I used to go up to the University Careers Service in my final year here. And I mean, the wonderful thing in a way is that so many of the careers that actually exist now were not even in a box file in the OUCS at that time. But I sort of thought that actually one of the things I come back and say is that getting involved in politics in the way that I did after university is a very, very good thing to do. It exposes you to it gives you wisdom beyond your years, I think, and those skills are very, very marketable, actually in other parts, in the corporate world. A lot of companies now, increasingly, because politics is becoming a bigger issue, not a smaller issue, need people who understand the political process from the inside. So I think that the historians should be more political. I'm back working in politics again now, I find it's very interesting to know. I would definitely say that there is an appetite among politicians for history. It's perhaps not quite like the great years in the 1960s in the United States yet, but there is an appetite for what historians have to say, and you see it in the kind of people who write for the papers and offer their views, but also in the kind of the willingness of politicians to find out about history. There's a guy called Keith Simpson, wonderful MP. He's the MP for one of the Norfolk constituencies, and he publishes every 6 months summertime, it's basically a sort of summer holiday reading list and a Christmas reading list of the books that he has enjoyed, or yes, the books he's enjoyed in the previous 6 months. They're all history books, all biography, and he recommends them. It's a really popular list because people are looking at what to take away to read on the beach, or what to give to somebody for Christmas, or read themselves. Because politicians, what do they want? They want to know the precedent. They want to know, I think it's at Johns Hopkins University, it has that, I think it's not, I don't know whose phrase it was, but history is past politics and politics is present history. And most politicians that I have come across are very aware of that and are very interested, therefore, by history as just a source of inspiration, perhaps, insight, what not to do. Even anecdotes. And let's face it, a good historical anecdote can diffuse a situation. I've heard one the other day which was particularly good, referring to the fact that Karlsruhe and Canning had fought a duel back 200 years ago, to point out that actually the situation in the Tory party was not that bad yet. And it's things like that. I think that's what they want. And so the question then is, what do historians have to do to sort of meet that desire? And of course, you've got websites like History and Policy, which exist to do that. You can now, through social media, particularly through Twitter, you can engage very directly with people if you think that they are misusing history, perhaps put it most politely. And what else? I mean, but the thing is that to be popular, or at least to be political, you've got to be popular, and that means, I think, writing for a popular audience. I think the big problem is the fact that a lot of the academic books that are published are, firstly, very expensive. That's the thing that I always notice as a popular historian trying to get hold of stuff. And that makes them inaccessible. It's really important not to spend all your time doing that, but very much to try to write for a popular audience, and to try to think about how, in that process, and the process of doing that, the publisher will actually force you to confront these issues about how to make your subject relevant to the present day. I see that my time is up. I've got a minute to go or something like that, and I think all I would finish by saying is that, of course, we can say what we like to politicians. We can advise them, we can tell them about the past, about what people have done on previous occasions, what has worked and what has failed. Whether they will listen to us is another matter.
Writing work of history is like making a sculpture. So, there's Vladimir Lenin. You have a subject. This is the truth about the world you are looking at. You have bronze or marble. These are the facts of the case. And once you finish the sculpture, it may resemble reality. There's the statue of Lenin in the Moskovsky district of St. Petersburg. Or it may be a distortion. That's Lenin in a dump in Ukraine. That's your narrative. So all historians have political opinions of their own. But some historians have political opinions dictated to them. This means that their sculpture will probably be disfigured, because rigid ideologies rarely convey a realistic picture of life. But it does not mean that those historians cannot make significant contributions to their field. So today, I think I'm going to argue that allowing your politics to determine what you're interested in can actually bring public attention to understudied or ignored parts of history. Even if you are motivated by an agenda, sometimes an agenda points you toward the truth. But politics only takes you so far. It might show you the right materials, but if you allow it to build the sculpture for you as well, you'll end up with a shoddy piece of work. So I think I'll take you back to a time and place where historians were expected to be relentlessly and proudly political, and where the very word objectivity was condemned by the state as dirty. So we're going to the GDR, East Germany, and specifically East German historiography of colonialism. I think that's an interesting area because it examines whether good historical work can be produced even in a very extreme political environment. But before turning to historians in the GDR, I want you to have a picture of the political pressures they faced. What kind of environment were they operating in? What was expected of historians? What were the consequences for non-compliance? So let's lay out East Germany's view of NATO states, and particularly of West Germany. This is Albert Norden. He was a member of the Central Committee, and he gave a 1967 speech as follows. In every West German enterprise, anti-democratism, neo-Nazism, and expansionist policy becomes the law. The Bonn government believes the Greater German Reich did not experience its downfall in May 1945, but had only suffered a temporary attack of weakness. This was overcome with the foundation of the Federal Republic in 1949, and between this state and the German Reich, there thus exists a legal continuity and identity. Thus it was claimed that West Germany was the successor state of the Third Reich, and before that of the Kaiser's Empire. West Germany therefore bore responsibility for both starting the Second World War and the Kaiser's long list of many misdeeds. East Germany, due to its progressive ideology and affiliation with Moscow, was absolved of accountability for these crimes. Furthermore, due to their mutual occupation of West Germany, the United States, and to a lesser extent Britain, assumed the role of puppet masters and became the new standard bearers of fascism in the world. So public propaganda in the GDR constantly promoted the narrative that NATO and West Germany were trying to forcibly contaminate the socialist bloc with neo-Nazis. So let me show you this by taking a look at some East German visual propaganda of the 1950s and 60s. That's Konrad Adenauer. He was Chancellor of West Germany, for those who don't know. He's holding an American flag, and he's resurrected as Adolf Hitler. So that's pretty neo-Nazi. This is one of my favorite pieces of propaganda. This is called the Revolver Nose. It's a cartoon from 1953. It's a gun, Rias, radio in the American sector. Right here you've got the dollar sign, that's the CIA on top of the gun. It's shooting at the GDR, and it's shooting lies and hate speech. Which shows you, by the way, how the GDR thought about soft power and propaganda in very similar terms to military invasion. This is a tabloid cartoon from 1969. It's called Be Swallowed Millions. That's actually a pun on Schiller, because there's a famous phrase in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, be embraced millions. Well, here's a West German worker shoveling $1,000 into West German government's mouth. You can see the little eagle here showing that's the West German government, in order to promote violence and neo-imperialism. Stop American Beatles. See? All right, you got the American Beatles, right? I don't know if they actually won. So that's the idea. This was actually about a fear of famine, right? A fear that that America was dropping Colorado beetles onto East German farms to poison them and make all the crops die. They weren't doing that. Okay. So here's an excerpt from the GDR's third-party Congress laying out the obligation of artists, academics, and teachers to the state. Quote, "We must engage in an unrelenting struggle against the cannibalistic doctrines of the imperialist warmongers. Any attempt to portray these hostile ideologies objectively is tantamount to spreading and thus aiding them." If East German historians expected to be published, this was the narrative that they had to promote in their academic work. They had to provide academic justification for that. So, those conditions nonetheless produced innovative and even groundbreaking work in some cases, which is quite surprising. One of the dubious advantages of being required to smear an enemy is that you have incentive to look really hard for bad things he's done, and sometimes in places few have looked before. So let's dive briefly into the case study of colonial historiography. This is a good place to explore because it approximates an organic experiment with natural controls. At the very beginning of the Cold War, before the Stalinization of GDR politics, there is evidence that permissible public narratives about colonialism were still similar across lines of occupation. The Iron Curtain divided these kindred environments into and applied a radical Marxist treatment to one of the sides. And by the early 1950s, it was clear that a major divergence was occurring in German academia. At one level, the GDR just got lucky because most of the important archives about colonialism happened to be there. Just luck. But in the East, there still was clearly a stronger institutional interest in the study of colonialism. As early as 1951, the GDR government provided funding to Leipzig University to conduct research into the Kaiser's exploitation of African peoples long before any such initiatives emerged in West Germany. So this was the beginning of a culture not only of Africa but also Asia studies that was already mature by the end of the 1950s. As Ulrich van der Heyden notes, the positions of these historians was, quote, unanimously anti-colonial, which even today is seen with amazement. And yet, despite complete uniformity and a clear risk of confirmation bias, this is a field where GDR historians not only excel, but often set the gold standard. To take a couple examples, in 1958, Helmut Stöcker published Germany and China in the 19th Century, The Invasion of German Capitalism. And despite this obviously accusatory title, the book became a standard reference work in both Germanys. Stöcker also edited a volume on German Cameroon that achieved similar status. There's that on the left. Likewise, Horst Drexler's 1966 book on imperial genocide in Namibia was so successful that the United Nations arranged for its translation into English, French, Russian, and Spanish. So in contrast, during this time, it was still quite common for West German historians to not only defend colonialism, but to even deny genocide. Warhol Drascher, he wrote a book called Guilt of Whites, ? Offering a comprehensive defense of colonialism in all its forms. Its thesis reads, quote, in spite of many errors and atrocities, colonialism has served the striving of mankind to achieve perfection. So the moral status of empire had already been decided in the GDR by this point, and East German scholars savagely castigated Drascher and like-minded scholars, whom they accused of dishonesty, weakness, and enslavement to bourgeois interests. So in April 1965, GDR historian Walter Markov took to the pages of the newspaper Neue Zeit to berate Drascher in the strongest possible terms. Quote, his textbooks educate the West German student in the spirit of neocolonialism. The atrocities of the former German colonial regime are concealed. Instead, they praise good deeds and cultural achievements. The causes, goals, and results of the liberation struggle of Afro-Asian peoples are distorted, while the principles of equal rights and non-interference in the internal affairs of other states are disregarded. Strong as these claims are, Easterners could legitimately say that they were producing better scholarship of colonialism than Westerners were. The best proof is that West German historians kept admitting that. During the Cold War, Günter Smolla, Ulrich Harman, Henning and Mary Melber, Wolfgang Mommsen, and Werner Hillebrecht repeatedly expressed insecurity about this matter. Even Drascher, who was known for his intense hostility to GDR writers, fretted that young African scholars will, quote, not go for our books to learn about their past, but they will seek out the Russian side. In fact, current German Africa studies, which almost completely shunned GDR historians in the 1990s, is ironically dominated by Westerners. And looks a lot more like GDR historiography than West German historiography. If anything, that is evidence that a highly politicized academic environment can sometimes yield innovative scholarship. But alas, these very solid blocks of marble did not produce the great sculpture they could have. It is true that Eastern historians were pointing in the right direction and using the right set of facts, but in the end, their scholarship could not escape its political provenance. Let's go through a few examples. Because they were obligated to morally condemn the West, GDR historians strained credulity, trying to think of ways to draw thin or non-existent connections between the old empire and West German foreign policy. For instance, third world aid programs would be twisted by scholars into hidden expressions of neocolonialism and neo-fascism, which the official press would then use to justify such accusations. So there's a 1971 Neues Deutschland article accusing West German foreign aid to more than 60 countries of being neocolonialism. Here is a 1972 caricature. The caption reads, foreign aid to Brazil? Yes, 100,000 policemen. So there's the neo-fascist component. But these notions have been soundly refuted in the last 20 years by experts like Heide Irene Schmidt, who report that, quote, West Germany had no ambitions to establish spheres of influence, and whose help was actually often requested by poor countries. The necessity of economic explanations in a Marxist framework also prompted historians to make dubious claims. This is Horst Drexler. In his 1966 History of Southwest Africa, Drexler repeatedly insists that economic policy motivated German expansion, but this does not hold up to modern standards. As Charles Wilson has written, quote, "No German had seriously argued the economic case for imperialism before 1885, and by this time the Berlin Conference had already been completed, and the decision to go into Africa had already been made." In the end, all German colonies, aside from Togo, were highly unprofitable. Few Germans wanted to move there. Businesses invested little. Recent scholarship of Wolfgang Fuhrmann and others has shown that propaganda of organizations like the German Colonial Society was primarily cultural, racial, and adventure-oriented. Furthermore, GDR historians tended to view African peoples as, at best, reactive actors, and at worst, passive non-actors, whose role either way was to essentially receive a continuous stream of beatings by ruthless invaders. After reunification, Drexler's work was viciously rebuked by Brigitte de Lau, who accuses him of being as much or even more hopelessly Eurocentric than West Germans, and of using Namibians as pawns in his anti-Western theses. Tellingly, there was a debate among GDR scholars over whether to prioritize, quote, African history or, quote, imperial history, and in the end, the latter won out. Finally, because they were promoting an official ideology, East German historians paid very little attention to non-communist scholarship and received, therefore, limited feedback. It is certainly safe to say that West German historians, due in part to their insecurities that I mentioned, paid a lot more attention to what was being written in the East than vice versa. And this meant that GDR scholars ultimately lost their head start. So where does all this leave us? What lessons can we take from historical scholarship in the GDR? Well, I think it's okay to allow political opinions to guide your interest, because it can motivate you to be original and to look in new places, places no one has gone before. That is, to use a fresh and new kind of material to build your sculpture. It is natural to want to prove a point. I think as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Barr, everyone is political. It's useless to deny it. There's no point in denying it. Everyone has some kind of political opinion. But you also have to be able to control your emotional attachment to an ideology or set of beliefs. You cannot allow your politics to write the conclusion for you, because in the end, your scholarship will not be the best it can be, and you will have done a disservice to yourself. The truth is out there. It is. But it does not care whether you're communist or conservative. To use one last metaphor, I know I've butchered these. Your beliefs are a compass, but not a roadmap to help you find the truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your presentations. I cannot believe you just made an X-Files reference, but thank you. So you've all touched on a number of really great points, and I guess a common theme that runs through all of these presentations is the question of what it actually means to be political as a historian. And I think you can all agree that it has something to do with your subject, your audience, your perspective. Even the scope that you take could be political in a certain way. And I guess before we come to your questions for each other, I wanted to ask whether you think that as historians we are inherently political. Is not the writing of history, the choosing of narratives, the spinning of narratives not an inherently political act, and to a certain extent is not a sort of determination to be more political, a way to be more ethical in our practice of history.
How do you want which order?
Seniority.
Age. So the question, Angeliki, is essentially politics is ethical, or to be more political is to be more ethical. I would have a lot of support for that notion. I think where my hesitation to embrace history and politics in the modern age is more a comment on where we are with politics than we are with history. I hope the audience has all seen that they really should be historians. It is a great place to be. we've got truth, apparently, which is very reassuring. But it is, on a more serious point, I think history, if you go back to the classical age, they would go, duh, yeah. We are not, are we reinventing the wheel here? Because history was always seen as part of a moral education. If you've read Aristotle's Politics, one of the earliest systematic analyses of the nature of politics and what it is, Aristotle was a good politician, political scientist. He collected his 150 constitutions, and he saw them very much as historical processes. And he did think that not just history, but a number of other subjects were vital attributes of a good citizen. So I do think, in fact, many past ages, many past generations would actually say that the way in which perhaps, for instance, history is being taught as a skill, a transferable skill, I hate that phrase, in both schools and even in universities, is missing its moral weight and the importance that it can do in thinking about not just how do I get through my life, where does my life stand in a broader set of contexts. I think there are some very fundamental cultural functions of history. And as long as there is a dynamic engagement with the past, I think one of the common themes that's come out from all of this is the importance to engage with the past. There are dangerous ways of doing it, but the importance is that you should do this. It is actually part of our moral liberty. We are free to do these sorts of things which are good for us. So I'd agree with Angeliki.
That's a very hard act to follow. I agree too. I would say that it's a good idea to sort of make a virtue of a sort of weakness. But I'm also then thinking of Philip's brilliant last slide, and that one always has to be aware of one's sort of biases. And I suppose from what I said earlier on, really, from my, in a sense, my own prejudices, best way to call them, have affected the kinds of the ways of the sort of the way I looked at the topic and went into it and spotted a topic that looked interesting. But I hope that once I actually got into it and then started doing my research, I was doing it in as neutral a way as possible, and trying not to sort of just find evidence that supported that particular position.
I think I'll stop that. Okay. Well, thank you for the question. So maybe I'll share a little personal anecdote. My mother grew up in the Soviet Union, and she was a mathematician. She specifically became a mathematician to avoid politics, because it was one of the few fields where you didn't really have to do any politics. Although, as I found out in my own studies, during the Stalin era, it was actually very politicized. Mathematics, all academia was politicized. But because it's equations for the most part, it's hard to politicize. So my mother had to take a test called History of the Communist Party. This was a mandatory test for all university students in the Soviet Union, to the best of my knowledge. And she almost flunked it. She basically flunked it. Like, she had no interest whatsoever. She was like, this is horrible, why would I do this? And I got thinking, why did she, because she was a good student otherwise, but she just didn't really care about this. And I think the reason is because it's assumed, it's presupposed in an environment like the Soviet Union that the history is just pre-written. It's presupposed that, whatever credibility it has, right, is already shot from the beginning. Because there's a conclusion written beforehand, and everything that you're doing is just building up to that conclusion, right? And I think that is, I understand, actually, I agree, there's sort of the spectrum, right, the idea of, there's the blurred line, where do you choose to limit your political, engagement with history? I understand. But there's a lot more danger at that side of the extreme, I think, that there is from not being political at all, right? And I think one of the biggest risks, and perhaps one of the most understudied risks, is that it just creates apathy. It creates apathy because you assume, even in a sort of liberal environment like the UK or the US, if you assume when you're reading a work of history that the person who's writing the work of history has a point to prove, and that's the main point of his writing, then you're going to immediately turn off at least half your audience, right? It's not going to be universal history. It's just going to be, basically a partisan thing for one side. And that sells sometimes, it does, and it can get published sometimes, depends on the publisher, right? But if you're talking about like actual academic credibility and you're talking about actually advancing the field, no, I don't think so. I don't think it works. No.
Did either of you want to address any of those points, or?
Start. I'd like, just to make sure, I thank you very much for the other presentation. It's very thought-provoking, and James, I love this definition that political is popular, and it feeds into what Philip was just saying about the importance of connecting with wider audiences, and it is something that if we have at one end of the spectrum academic historians writing for 4 other people who they know, then that's not very helpful for actually probably for themselves or for the Republic. But I always think one of the great things about academic history, and maybe this is something that academics should use as a foundation for a broader engagement, is actually the teaching aspect of the university. Of course, it's not just on the history side of things. Because I'm always very struck, in fact, that yes, we are learning the skills which will be very useful for citizens going out into the polis. But actually, the number of times we actually are making moral calls with our students, and going back to the point you made, Philip, about the way in which, bizarrely, the GDR generated new ideas and new interests. I think that's one of the great attractions of the subject, is that it is so, it's so slippery at one level, but it is so vast, and that it does make people think very naturally of the universal, even as they are studying the detail, if you like, and particular views about particular events, whatever. So I think in those sort of ways, this is why, I love Gibbon, like I showed you, I love him, because he is someone who, whilst writing a pretty standard narrative at times, can, in a footnote, encapsulate the human condition. And I think it's been able to move through between those various levels. Not every, I'm not saying I do that in tutorials, I can stress this, but there is a moral force behind it. And if we can expand that role, it's one of the things we've discussed. If I had a question for my 2 panelists here, and we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, is, do we need to unpack the historian here? We've been looking a lot at politics. And what sort, do we need various types of historian? The sort of historian I take to see actually would be, a historian of the GDR. I felt, having been to Berlin recently, it frightened me. Every historical cultural reference. And I have, conversed with people who were brought up in that terrifying atmosphere. And we know we don't want the state to be producing historians at one level, or at least directing what they do. But what sort of historians do we need?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And to think of it, one example, one thing that I didn't mention in my talk, but which I did want to bring up, was an idea that the British Academy had the other day to sort of bring in-house historians into government, which would affect, I mean, they're not quite state historians in that respect, but the idea that that places need an institutional memory, and that the Foreign Office already has this. They have a group of FCO historians who exist to sort of produce papers giving people a bit of the, you know, the background. And they're very, very interesting. They're freely available. They're not sort of secret or anything. You can just download them off their website. And I think that fulfills a very, very important function in just giving people that sort of background. When I worked in the city for a while, for a company that was created in about 1982, and some of the people who were involved, present at that creation, still work there. They were approaching retirement, but they were still there, and they served that function. But there was always a question in my mind that when they retired, and most of them have now, what would happen? Because they were the kind of people you went to when you had a brilliant idea for some sort of commercial wheeze. They would say, well, we tried that in 1986 and it didn't work for the following reasons. And they were sort of, if you like, they were the historians for that. So the British Academy is proposing the sort of, to institutionalise this much more. And when you think of there was a scare, I say it's a scary statistic. I have nothing to compare it with, so I don't know how scary it is. But the Department for exiting the EU, the average age of a civil servant there is 31. Now that may seem very old to most of you, but it sounds quite young to me. And it might actually be that across Whitehall the average age is not much higher than that, but I think it was noticeably low. And in that kind of situation, when you have young people, or at least people who've not necessarily had a lot of experience in any department for that matter, it would be good to have people who can try to provide that sort of extra depth that helps good decision making. And that doesn't quite answer your question, but I think I've got away with it.
Oh, well, if I could add another point, there are many points to make, obviously. I think an element of human psychology, if you talk about deconstructing the historian, well, the historian is a human like anyone else. And there are some interesting things you could note. For example, there's been some study in psychology and international relations on the topic of the negativity bias. Now, in every single human being, the brain is hardwired to view negative events more in greater detail than positive events. They've done all kinds of studies on this. 5 insults to your partner equals, or rather 5 good remarks to your partner equals 1 insult, one rose, right? So, and the same applies to history in a sense. For example, why is there such a fixation on the failure of appeasement? There's endless discussion. You probably have thousands of books by now on how appeasement failed. But it is, after all, just one case. It just happened to be a really important case, of course. But the point is that if introducing sort of historical awareness doesn't always, I understand the Churchill quote that, the longer you look back, the more you see forward. It's a good quote. And I agree to an extent. But sometimes if you introduce history, it doesn't always produce a better outcome. Right? Sometimes you fixate on certain negative things and just repeat them over and over again in your mind and be like, I don't want it to be like this. I don't want it to be like that. Right? I mean, in more recent terms, I'm sure all of you can tell how important the Iraq War is in everyone's mind whenever talking about foreign policy. Whenever talking about, especially American foreign policy, but also British foreign policy, there's always a discussion of the Iraq War was such a failure, we can't repeat it. Right? And it is only one case, after all. And conditions vary across cases. And I don't know if there's necessarily all that much wisdom in transplanting these things, right? And I think the farther back you go, like 200 years, 300 years, the less applicable these things are, So that's the point to make.
Do you have any more responses to each of those presentations?
We'll do it then.
All right, we can do that. Well, then in that case, let's open it up to the audience for the blonde hair.
So you all will recently have heard about Jacob Rees-Mogg speaking about concentration camps and the Boer War. And so he said that, that the reason that people were put into concentration camps was for their protection, and he said that the death rate in these camps was exactly the same as in Glasgow at the time, which becomes an interesting comparison when you find out that Glasgow was at the time experiencing an outbreak of the plague. But I find it very interesting to think about why Rees-Mogg would choose to engage in that debate in the first place. And I think, just off the top of my head, that is something to do with what William Golding distinguishes as personal history. And that for most people, I would think, history to them is a source of identity. And they feel an affinity with their ancestors and so on. And so Kwame Anthony Appiah, he's a philosopher, not a historian, but he recently did the Leith lectures on the type of mistaken identities. And his position is that philosophers should not tell the public what to think, but try to give them tools to think for themselves. So with all that in mind, what do you think the role of the historian is in that kind of setting?
Is that for all of us?
For all of us.
All of us, at least. Okay. I remember Jacob Rees-Mogg as a student.
Wow.
That's part of my history, and I can't change it, unfortunately. No, I mean, it's an interest. I mean, this is just to deal with him first of all. I don't know why politicians use history in the way that they do. It's so unsystematic. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm not a fan of the man. He's an intelligent person. He is undoubtedly someone who actually has read widely and well. Yet the way that he uses history sort of worries me, because again, that's a good example of someone has given him the tools to think, and it does not necessarily head in good directions. I mean, that's the problem of the use of history. It is so open. And history, as often as not, has been used for terrible justifications. And again, don't want to keep going back to Gibbon, but I have. And again, the philosophe historian of the 18th century, who would be taking a more, if you like, objective view of trying to study man as, as an animal, as a political animal. They found it impossible to find some form of, objective use of history by man. They didn't actually draw very clear lessons from their use of history, and so that's one of the problems. But it's not just a problem; it's an opportunity, because of course whatever Rees-Mogg says can be challenged. You've challenged him extremely well there. You're right. I mean, just because there are these similar death rates doesn't mean it's a good thing. It probably highlights exactly the opposite. What we need is, if someone is coming in with history, that it's effectively challenged. I notice now, and it's a sad sign of the times, that the BBC website has a regular fact checker. And it's always looking at history, and trying to show that in fact politicians are, at the very least, have to be challenged on this. And so it does sadden me, and this is why, again, my head is saying no, because too often we actually are seeing history used just for a cheap headline.
That's very thought-provoking, and so is your question. I mean, I suppose my instant thought is what you have already said, Perry, which is that there is now the means to call that sort of thing out and to provide a different view, the facts, whatever you want to call it. And actually, I was just thinking that let's imagine this. We had this discussion 25 years ago when I was here as an undergraduate, the kind of methods that exist now to enable you to do that, and I'm thinking primarily Twitter probably, just didn't exist. And in fact, the idea that somebody who was a very engaged, intelligent undergraduate or graduate student who knew exactly about a particular subject and saying this is rubbish, you could have written a letter, I suppose, and posted it to SW1 and awaited a reply, or maybe a letter to the paper, I suppose, back in those days. But that didn't kind of exist. So in a way, there's a difference between historians being political and politicians being historical. Quite an important one. And the use of history by politicians is, we've seen it over the last few weeks with sort of comments about the Marshall Plan and that, and Churchill as ever, Churchill endlessly. But actually, I'm thinking back to the idea of historians engaging and trying to nudge people and say, no, that's absolute rubbish, or have you thought about that? And I'm also thinking, those are the sort of the egregious examples, but I'm thinking much more of the kind of ongoing, sort of the way that history can really inform politics. An example I came across when I was thinking about this was from I think in an article in the New York Times from maybe 20 years ago or so, talking about the sort of the trend to applied history that began around that time, maybe even earlier than that. In part, actually, they said they thought it was partly because a lot of people were finding it difficult to find academic tenure as historians, and therefore they were kind of moving more into jobs where they could influence things. But the example they gave was a very, very sort of simple one. It was somebody who had studied the regulation of, it was about pollution in the water supply, and basically just saying about how some laws were brought in the 1950s to try to stop basically chemical companies dumping effluent in rivers. And there was a historian who said, well, actually, they tried that in the 1930s, and the result was they all dug lagoons, I think they called them, and they just poured the effluent into these lagoons instead, and with the result that the groundwater supply was poisoned rather than the rivers. As a sort of, a kind of object lesson in we have tried this, or you have tried this before, and it failed then, and it will fail now.
Actually, I had not heard that Rees-Mogg said that, but it does not surprise me. This reminds me of the way that prior to the U.S. Civil War, there were a million Southern justifications for slavery. And it's kind of astonishing reading them. Just endless, inferiority, or it's good for them. That's what reminds me. It was good for them. They need it, right? And I think that example, actually, is a classic case of the misuse of history and the damage it can cause. After the Civil War, there was an enormous campaign of falsification that happened in the American South. Basically, the whole states' rights idea was a myth invented in the 1870s, right? If you actually read what Confederate politicians were saying, the justifications were almost exclusively for slavery, about slavery as a way of life and our right to maintain it. But in the 1870s, you had all of these historians, whatever you want to call them, politicians, political activists, maybe at that time it was kind of a conflated term, falsifying this in unbelievable terms, so just basically just lying. And so to this day, you still have textbooks that say this. To this day, you still have that. These things have reverberations that last centuries, right? And what's interesting is, it's a case where the manipulation of history in a certain window can basically set something in stone, right? So who knows if the South had been sort of more forthcoming or honest about the history of the Civil War at that period, we could have had a completely different situation. Could have had a totally different situation. And it's interesting how, even today, it's like people who look back on this, there's this current movement to take down Confederate monuments, right? I'm sure you've all heard about that. The Democratic Party is at the forefront of doing this. The Democratic Party is absolutely, and I personally support it as well. But almost always omitted from this discussion is the fact that the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, right? And the party of segregation. And in fact, the main promoters of these evils, right? So sometimes what's interesting is that When you try to scrub history, it's covering up your own problems, right? And I don't know, someone, in the case of Rees-Mogg, who knows what he's trying to cover up? Who knows what his agenda in his head is, right? But again, it just goes back to the point that at some level, it's impossible to assume that people won't be political. Everyone is political. Everyone approaches history from a political environment, right? This is why, as I said in my talk, the best thing is not to try to, limit yourself, put on a chastity belt and say no politics in history, right? That's not going to work. It's all about trade-offs. It's all about limiting the damage, right? It's about limiting the damage that you inflict, because if you let it go rampant, then you end up with the history of the Communist Party that my mom took.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, you over there?
I'm just, recently I think that politics has shifted to kind of climate when it's become based more on conflict between different kinds of histories. So taking the whole Confederate statues into account, there is a history on one side of obviously the Confederacy and the rights of the South and whatnot. However, there's also the competing history of social justice movements in the US. And the problem for the historian is, by what right do they place greater value on one history as compared to the other one by, perhaps supporting, taking down monuments? They might be discrediting the history of the Confederate States.
I'm not sure. Okay, I'll quickly respond. What's interesting about your point is that there's almost always overlap. Almost always overlap in a rather amazing way. Woodrow Wilson, very progressive president, Klan supporter of the Ku Klux Klan. First movie ever screened in the White House, Birth of a Nation, under Woodrow Wilson. Resegregated the entire Navy. Woodrow Wilson, but he's also viewed as a progressive. 14 points, self-determination, these are progressive things. But you have, sometimes, in every human heart, there are things at the same time, right? There are evils that coexist with progress at the same time. And I think that, just as in the case, what is represented in the person of a Confederate statue? More than one thing. Right? There are multiple things going on inside that person's brain when he was alive, and he represents more than one thing, right? So I think that it's important to recognize that blurred lines are the rule, not the exception.
I think the polarization of history is, first of all, is nothing new, as we've already heard. But it is a crucial question to ask, is how you respond to those sort of polarities. And I'll tell you a small story. When I was on jury service many years ago, I was reading, we were sent out by the judge through a month-long case, and I got to know someone on the jury, and he saw me reading history books, and he saw me reading a history book about the English Civil War, and in particular about Cromwellian Ireland. And he asked my opinion. What do you think of Cromwell? Do you see him as the dark destroyer or the liberator of the island? And my answer was, more or less, it's a bit more complicated than that. We talked about this. And it was at that stage that he revealed that he was a member of the BNP. And would I like to come to the pub to meet some of his friends to discuss these issues? And to my shame, I passed up on the chance of doing that. But what that highlights, I think, and this is one of the social, the political roles of history, is that it's got to learn to navigate the more immediate polarities of any society. Good history is contested history. Now, hopefully societies are not so divided that they have extremes in their history and indeed extremes in their daily life. And I think it's important to have free and open discussion about what the relationship between historical past events and present needs are. That's very, very important. And I think, you know, in all of the discussions we've had so far, it shows that we must have an open debate. Again, you can't regulate this. And unfortunately, whether it's Jacob Rees-Mogg or anybody else, they need to have their voice. They need to be shown. Because actually, the one thing that historians actually do really well is patiently measure the past and then try to explain it. And the explaining will always be debated, but it's that measuring part which will always call out the extreme positions. I have a great confidence in that, and I think that's one role that the Academy can do. But we need lots of other types of historian. I think we need people who can, for instance, enter those political debates and call out those who are making unsubstantiatable claims. But it's in some ways, I say polarity is bad, extreme polarity is bad, but good debate, we're not getting good quality debate. And I think that's what all I was trying to get at in my talk, is that perhaps we need to work harder on the audience for history within politics, rather than necessarily keeping history out of politics.